In January of 1977, a prison escapee held a family hostage for 55 hours, playing mind games with them while killing their loved ones in different rooms in their own home. The questions about this case that remain unanswered over 40 years later open up a wider topic. Could a lack of accountability for the murders Billy Hughes committed lead to what happened at Pottery Cottage happening again? This is the story of Pottery Cottage murders. They're done for the day, they're done for the day. On this dingy street where I live, wait, don't spy on me when I spy on you. On this dingy street where I live, right? Somebody managed to actually sell their property, which was disgusting. I found the ad online. But now, because it was so bad and it was so old, they're redoing the house from scratch. I'm gonna log off the work laptop. I clearly have WhatsApp on it. This is great content. This is a great mic check. But finally, I think they have done their works for the day, which would have significantly impacted the sound. This is why I'm clearly telling you this information prior to this video. I think they're done. Let me log off work and let's motherfucking begin. I like to pry. I like to know everything. This is why you're here. It's addictive. And I also want them gone. Like, I also really want to know how long they're gonna take on this project. What's going on? I need to log off. I'll be right back. Manic energy, claim it. Take it and claim it. And brush my teeth like it's toothpaste on my face. Good. Let's begin. Detective Unit, we're all gathered here today for the part 2 and the final part on the Pottery Cottage murders. If you haven't listened to part 1 and would like to understand the psychology of Billy Hughes, his crimes, the build-up of it all, his prison time and then the escape from prison, and also learn about who lived at the Pottery Cottage, I would really suggest listening to the 2-hour video that I have made in terms of part 1. And part 2 is going to be the continuance of that story. So I'm just going to quickly recap what had happened in part 1 and where we left it off, and then we'll pick up in the timeline, talk about 55 hours that Billy had spent with the family at the Pottery Cottage, the chase, the outcome of his crimes, describe the crime scene, and obviously talk about what had happened afterwards, like the investigation that occurred beyond the year 1977 and where this case stands today. Now, before recapping part 1, I just have to point out a couple of trigger warnings when it comes to this parter. If you, despite of my warnings, listen to part 1, you will probably find this parter to be even more sensitive. It still includes the topics of rape, extreme violence, it's very heavy on psychopathy and just mind games that this man played with his family for over 2 days, and then it will include the descriptions of multiple brutal murders of the family. So if this is not something that you would like to listen to right now, if you're not in the right headspace, if these are the topics that you're sensitive towards, I would suggest click out of this one. Probably you haven't watched part 1 in that case as well, or just space it out. Do what works best for you, but this topic is just heavy. There is a part of this story where I just sobbed for about 15 minutes, and then I continued to write the script, and then there's another part where I just was like, oh my god, this story will never stop being sad, will never stop being grim. Like the influence and just the vile nature of this man and like the impact that it had had on everybody surrounding him, even so many years after his crimes, is just something so bizarre to me and wild. Don't surround yourself with people with bad energy, that's what I'm saying. If they have bad juju, if they're just like negative and constantly vile human beings, just go to somebody who, like, I don't know, is in a good mood sometimes, has like something nice to say about the world, I don't know, doesn't fucking exploit violence, express violence, isn't a violent human piece of shit, okay? Isn't a waste of sperm. Go to somebody who isn't a waste of sperm and your life will be richer for it. Cool. Okay, let's recap part 1 now, because you have went in a weird direction there. So, in part 1, we have spoken about Billy Hughes, the man who was escalating in offenses. He started off from petty crimes, however, his crimes were always violent. He was just adding violence as he went along. He was violent towards police officers, he was violent towards people that he robbed, and eventually he added rape. And then, once he was jailed one last time, he was about to add murder to his list. This is because Billy never intended to stay locked up. He had a job within prison kitchens, and in December of 1976, he ends up stealing a boning knife. Now, for a month, this man will be sitting on this knife. There were searches during the prison, there were searches on him, there were pat-downs. However, he still manages to keep this knife hidden somewhere for over a month up until the 12th of January 1977, which is when he had one of his last court hearings. And at that point, they were transporting prisoners via cab. So there was a taxi driver riding the cab and then two police officers. One of them was handcuffed to Billy in the back of the car. During this car ride, Billy manages to overpower both of these police officers after a toilet break and also then overpower the cab driver. He had severely injured both police officers and had demanded for the two of them and the cab driver to get out of the car. And from this point on, Billy had been on the run. Now we have a family that is living together at the Pottery Cottage, which is just a house that will materialize itself just as Billy has left the car behind and is now walking. He doesn't have the possession of the knife anymore because he has just dropped it as he was jumping over this fence. And when this house materializes itself, he spots two axes that were just outside of this family's shed. Now at the Pottery Cottage, there is a family that's living together. We have a husband and wife, Jill and Richard, who are living there with Jill's parents, Amy and Arthur. We know that their 10-year-old daughter Sarah and 4 pets live with them as well. And we have learned that up until this point, they have lived a great routine-like life. This is the kind of information that Billy will not be privy to, however, it will severely go into his favor from this point on. At this moment in our timeline, Billy is in the house already. He walked in with those 2 axes that he had found outside that belonged to the family, and Amy, who was Jill's mom and Arthur's wife, is inside of the kitchen just making a meal for everybody. Amy and Arthur were the only 2 people that were in the house at this moment in time, and Arthur had heard some commotion. He had heard somebody enter, so he came from the rooms upstairs to see who was there. Was it Jill returning from work early? However, what he will encounter is Billy Hughes with 2 axes entering their kitchen. We ended part 1 with Jill coming back home and her mom waiting for her at the door, warning her that they have a visitor who is on the run from the police. Let us discuss what was happening at the Pottery Cottage before Jill walked through that door after her shift at work. Because at this moment in time, the police is still very much so playing catch-up. They are looking at the position where his car had been found and trying to figure out the radius of how far could he have walked, what were the theories, what would this man do based on his previous behavior.
Using the map, can you retrace the events of yesterday morning?
Yes, the initial attack occurred here at junction 29. From there, they went along this road into and out of Chesterfield onto the A632. At the bottom of Stanage Hill, where the cross is, the 2 warders and the driver were forced out of the taxicab. The wanted man then drove it up the hill and along this road here, and at the point where the cross is marked, he crashed the car. You'll see it's about 4 miles north of Matlock, and that the A6 road is quite close.
And he made off into Beelymore.
Then he made off across the fields, yes.
Inside of the cottage, Billy took control of the situation. He explained calmly to both Arthur and Amy that if they do as he says, he is going to eventually leave them alone. However, then he made both of them give him the tour of the house. And this is when he's just walking behind them with the axes. He's examining different rooms of the house, and I'm only going to mention the ones that will be prevalent to this story. So there will be sort of like the living room area downstairs. There will be the main kitchen where a lot of events in this story will take place, and obviously this is where he had just embarked on as he entered the house. As he is still downstairs, he spots that there is a phone that had been connected, and he disconnects it immediately. He doesn't want any interference from the outside world. The couple is then going to show him the rooms upstairs. The first room that he's going to see will be Jill's and Richard's bedroom. And then he moved on to Sarah's room. Sarah's room, it had been said, reflected the personality of a 10-year-old that lived and slept there to a T. There was the whole wall of her artwork, there was the National Cycling Proficiency Certificate, there was a full bookcase, a lot of soft toys, different stickers, the cassette player, pony posters, and a wooden headboard with a sellotape photo of a baby seal. Billy would leave Sarah's room without saying a word, and then they went back downstairs. They passed through another narrower kitchen because, as you remember me mentioning in part 1, Minton's and Moran's part of the house was quite separate. So we have gone through Jill, Richard's and Sarah's area, and then he passed through a narrower kitchen into Amy's and Arthur's abode. This is where they had their sitting room diner. There was another annex space downstairs, and then he went upstairs to see their bedroom and bathroom. Satisfied, they return to the kitchen, and he keeps asking about the people who live in this house, and he finds out a lot of information. He finds out about their schedule, that Jill is yet to return home, that there is obviously Sarah, whose room he had seen, and then that there is Richard, who was on business trip that day. He actually went to Birmingham. So nobody really knows when Richard is exactly going to come back home. When it comes to Jill and Sarah, they kind of tell him, well, this works like clockwork because they have their routines, so they know when to expect those two. However, at least in my mind, and I know this is a sideline, but at this point, I think Billy had decided on something. After he had seen Sarah's room and then had the tour of the rest of the house, after he had spotted the personality all over this room, this is going to become crucial in how he controls the family for almost 3 days. Back in the kitchen though, as he's now waiting for the next person to come in, which will be Jill in the next couple of minutes, Billy is just opening all of the drawers. He's seeing what's inside, what he can use. And as he is kind of proficient when it comes to knives at this point, he finds the specialist knife that he slides into his belt. And he will kind of drop the axes here and there, but this knife he's going to have on him for the duration of this hostage attack, just so that you can picture it in your head, like as I am portraying every scene or everything that is going on, he has this knife on him. There's a constant loom of threat when it comes to Billy wherever he is inside of this house, and especially now when the family is still concentrated in the kitchen area. The beige car parks up and Jill enters the house. Amy waits for her at the door and tells her that there is a man who had escaped prison. Jill at first is also calm. She thinks like, okay, this is a situation that we have going on now. However, she believes like he's just going to rob them. He just stopped by, he's on the run, he's going to rob them, get the money, and then get the hell out. So she makes them all tea, and they just all keep chatting. The first indication that Billy wasn't just there to rob them, but rather had more sinister motivations behind his presence at the Pottery Cottage was when he started conjuring up a plan of what they are all to do if the police was to turn up at the door right now. Like if they're doing the searches of the neighborhood and they suspect that this lunatic on the run is holding a family hostage. And his plan here was for a bath to be running inside of the bathroom, and if the police was to come around, he is going to be inside of that bathroom with Jill, and then Amy will come to the door and be like, oh yeah, my daughter is just in the bath, because of course then the police is not going to just barge into a bathroom if there's a woman naked there, and that would lead the police on their way. So for the whole family to basically lie on his behalf. Jill, as well as her parents, are just going along with it at this point. They just believe, like, maybe he's there to rob them. Whatever he's there to do, he will be gone by the end of the night. None of them at this point is suspecting that Billy might have thought of a more sinister plan. And that plan will start coming into fruition upon Sarah reaching home. So Jill knew around 3:40 p.m. the school bus is going to pop up by the street. Sarah's just gonna come in running. So she is now panicked, trying to figure out how to prevent her daughter from realizing what's actually happening. So she spots the two axes that were like visible at this moment in time, and she just puts them under some laundry that was there to be ironed. But also on top of that, she's thinking, okay, what can I give Sarah as an excuse? She is smart. Sarah is, as you will find out, super clued up when it came to everything. When it comes to Billy and once she enters this house. And because this was the isolated area, because there are not that many neighbors nearby, Jill knew that Sarah would buy into a story of somebody having their car break down and then coming in to use the phone to call somebody else to, like, for a tow, basically the car to be towed out. And then the family just offered him a cup of tea. So that is exactly what happens. Sarah walks through that door, she asks who the man is, they tell her that story, she doesn't really pay much attention to that anyways, she doesn't see the axis, she doesn't see anything out of the ordinary. She goes to her room and picks up her sewing kit, and then the whole family moves with her to the living room as she's just like working on her sewing. At this point, the situation is quite calm. Really, it just seems like a very domesticated scene. Billy even helps Sarah out when she's just stuck rethreading the needle. And at some point, Sarah even goes to the kitchen to get herself a drink, and she spots the hidden axes. So she asks Jill, what are those for? And Jill responded that Arthur was basically just using them. She guides Sarah back to the lounge, and at this point, Billy is just restless, right? Like, there's already some movement, he already can't control the situation, and yet again, I think, like, pin this moment in the back of your head, because I think it's crucial in terms of his actions afterwards. So he just starts pacing the house, he's going back and forth, he's going up and down, and Sarah actually spots that and says, he's a nice man, but why does he go wandering all over the place? So at some point, Sarah gets bored of the stewing and she suggests, like, can I just go watch TV? And her and Arthur, so her granddad, move towards the annex area, so the area downstairs, to watch the house. At this point, Billy is impatient as hell. Now, like, he kind of feels like he had lost control of this family. They're in two separate rooms, there's still one member of the family to come through the door, and both Jill and Amy are telling him Richard is not gonna put up a fight. Like, he is a man of peace, he's just going to hand you over the car keys and you can go and leave us alone. And this is what the family believes will happen as Richard walks through the door. Because of his impatience, even before Richard goes through the door, Billy makes Jill plug the phone back in. So he didn't actually cut the cord, and this yet again will become important later in the story. So remember the woman that I mentioned in first part that helped adopt the baby that then Sarah used to play with as a child, and they still did? Well, that woman actually made the phone call to Pottery Cottage. So as soon as the phone had been plugged in, Jill has to pick up a phone with Billy, with a knife, standing, breathing behind her neck. And he made her plug that phone back in, if I'm not making that clear, in order for her to get any calls by Richard, for him to finally figure out when Richard is exactly coming home. However, now he's faced with a situation that he hadn't predicted before in his head, and that is that other people can ring that same freaking landline. This phone call will be one of the many calls that the family had received where their neighbors or friends were just to check up on them and to be like, hey, have you heard there's a person on the run? Did Sarah make it home safely? Did Richard make it home safely? So that's exactly what this woman called Anne was wondering. And Jill just kept it completely calm. She said like, yep, Sarah's here, no, Richard's on a business trip, he's still to come home. But nope, I haven't heard anything, but don't worry, like everybody's safe. And she drops the phone, and from that moment on, Billy knew that he can trust her. He can trust her to remain calm in any situation. After that phone call, as Arthur and Sarah are still in the annex watching TV, he moves Amy and Jill towards the kitchen area and he starts looking for a map. Again, giving them the idea and just the false impression that he is going to leave that night. As soon as Richard appears, he might take the car and leave. However, then they hear the car park up. Richard walks in and, as expected, he just offers up the keys and an option for Billy to escape without them telling anybody. However, this is when Billy finally springs into action. What the family hadn't noticed as Billy was walking up and down is that he had found a vacuum cleaner and a washing line, and he cut out the flex from those, and he will use this flex to tie up the whole family. So here he starts by overpowering the man of the household. In this case, this would be Richard, because he was still younger than Jill's dad, Arthur. He overpowers him, Jill, and Amy and ties their hands. And as they're screaming, as there's commotion, Sarah and Arthur walk in. Sarah started screaming, "Don't you hurt my mommy and daddy. Don't you dare. Get out, you hurt people." Billy is still tying the rest of the family, and then he starts tying Arthur up. However, Arthur was the only one here to put up some sort of a fight. He tried to resist, but he was obviously no match to somebody a lot younger and a lot stronger than him. Now everybody is tied up. Their wrists and ankles are all tied, except from Sarah. Sarah is just in a state of shock, and she goes into the living room and is just sitting there. As he had tied their wrists and ankles, he realizes he has to gag them in order for them not to make any sound. And then he realizes, what if some of them have their dentures in? So he asks them to take the dentures out. However, here, because he had tied them, they can't do that. So he had to take the dentures out, just further humiliating everybody in the family. Jill asked him not to gag her mom, Amy, because she had sinusitis, but he just didn't care. And this is when, once the whole family is tied and gagged, he just takes each and every one of the members of the family over their shoulder. So he takes Richard first and puts him into the room, the guest room upstairs. Then he takes Jill to the bedroom that she shared with her husband. He takes Amy into Sarah's room, and then he puts Arthur downstairs in an armchair. Now Sarah, from downstairs, as everybody's in the room just listening in to what's going on and can't speak because they're all gagged, is saying, "Don't be fooled, Mom. He's being quiet. He hasn't gone yet." Those would be the last words that Jill will hear Sarah speak before Billy took her through to the annex area. As the family is now separated, that each member is in their own allocated area in the house, they're just listening in to what's happening. And then the phone rings. So Billy runs upstairs, takes Jill downstairs to the phone, and just removes her gag and puts the receiver to her ear. This was another man calling for Richard. They were calling about a job application, and basically just Jill managed to divert the conversation, saying that Richard hadn't made it home yet. As she returns home, she realizes after Billy leaves that her mom managed to untie herself. And she just went to her room to tell her, like, okay, I think, like, he's still here. And just as you think, like, I don't know, she's going to manage to untie the whole family, they're going to conjure up a plan, Billy realizes there is commotion. He goes upstairs and ties Amy back up and moves her to the room where he put her first, into Sarah's room. As Jill is listening to the rest of the house at this point, she hears muffled cries from downstairs, and she presumes that this is Billy beating up her dad, Arthur. And again, in my personal opinion, this is probably because he was the only member of the family who actually stood up to him, and Billy just couldn't take it because of his proclivity towards violence. He just couldn't take being humiliated in any way like that, or being shown up any sort of violence, any sort of protest towards him when he's trying to subdue the whole family. So after that, the whole house falls silent, and he brings drinks to the family upstairs. And at this point, Jill could hear her mom and Richard. After giving everybody tea, he goes into Jill's room and he removes her bonds. And she knew what is going to happen because he just removed her bonds from her wrists and ankles and her mouth. So she tells him that she's on her period, and he said that she's going to relieve him in another way. After the assault, after the rape, he changes up his whole attitude towards Jill. He sort of tries to warm her up, saying how he has a daughter of his own, how her name is Nicola, he tells her how much he loves her, and how he would never hurt Sarah. He tied Jill back up, however, this time he put her hands before her and he also didn't gag her. However, as she was just left in bed shivering, asking where is Sarah, and him confirming that she is just in the annex area, just watching TV, doing what the kids do, he proceeds to go into the guest room, and for the whole night he just goes and chats with Richard, who is the only person that is based there. And it is said he just chatted about anything, about security systems and how he in his criminal days used to go into places like Pottery Cottage and how people should really invest in security systems because this wouldn't have happened. And it was just like the dull talk of all of his crimes and his criminal career and everything, as if he is with his other criminal buddies in a pub and they're chatting about this over a pint. Also, in my opinion, there's something so sinister to this and really speaks to this man's psychopathy, and that is that when he rapes, sexually assaults his wife, he then goes to the husband to sort of show the power, to show some sort of domination over this whole family, and how he just raped his wife and then he can go and chat with this man, with him being completely clueless to the whole situation. The neighboring family, the Newmans, went outside that evening to exercise their dogs. However, they didn't notice anything odd when it came to Pottery Cottage. If anybody was to have screamed inside of that house that evening, they would be able to hear it. However, the whole family, the 5 hostages at this point, were all bound and gagged, left in the separate rooms to have a sleepless night. Jill was in her own bedroom, Amy was in Sarah's room, Richard was in the guest room speaking to the person that had kidnapped them and is holding them hostage. Sarah was said to either be in the grandparents' bedroom or it was believed that she was in the annex. And Arthur was just in the living room downstairs in the armchair. The whole night Jill was just lying in bed listening into the different rooms and the sounds emanating from them, and she was able to hear the muffled sounds from the guest room where Billy was trying to build rapport with her husband. She stayed awake the whole night, and then in the morning on the day 2 of the hostage takeover, Thursday, the 13th of January 1977, Billy just marched into her room. He told her she is to put clothes on, put makeup on, he let her out of her bounds, and she's going to go outside and just get some newspapers for the family. On his mission, apart from taking all the newspapers for him to feed his ego and also find out how far the police had come in actually thinking of a feasible theory to locate him, she was also to check for any roadblocks. So he had told her to take one route to the newsagents and then take a different route home, and she was not to do anything out of the ordinary. So she had to have her hair the way she usually would and her makeup the way she usually would. And at this point, he knew what she looked like when she came back from work, but also had seen all of the family pictures. So she knew she just had to comply. During this morning, because of the weather, the police is searching the houses. However, they're in the opposite area. They're not even close to where Billy is when it comes to the Pottery Cottage. And also the army offered up 2 helicopters. for them to do the air searches. However, as Billy is inside, this would just be void, and because of the snow conditions, those searches were also called off. The other thing that went into Billy's favor is that most schools didn't actually open up that first day due to the weather conditions, and even the ones that did, well, they wouldn't be alarmed if somebody was to call in sick, A, because it's cold as hell and like they could have caught a bug, or because they just couldn't physically make it to school. The same when it comes to workplaces because of the conditions at the time. However, what didn't go into his favor was the van that just parked up at the Pottery Cottage. Because Jill and the whole family, having completely been taken by this whole situation, have forgotten that there was a council worker that was supposed to show up that morning at 7:30 sharp to clear out their septic tank. As Jill is headed towards the door to greet this council worker to try to act as normal as she possibly can, she notices in the living room that her dad is at that armchair, but he's just looking abnormal. Like the color doesn't match up. Arthur, as you remember, had an artificial leg as well. That leg looks under a different angle. However, before she even processes any of it, Billy drags her towards the door, tells her to act normal. So that's exactly what she does. This person, this council worker, was also interviewed later, and he said he didn't spot anything. She greeted him, showed him where the septic tank was, he cleared it out, he gave her the invoice, she signed it, and he was just on his way. After the council worker left, Jill didn't even have the time to go back and check up on her dad, and Billy just lied saying that he is sleeping because he dragged her towards the phone and he asked her to call in sick, so she does. This person was also interviewed later, and they said the only kind of giveaway of sorts would have been a long break before Jill had spoken, but obviously there's nothing really in that. It could have just been that she picked up the phone and was feeling sick, because she will tell them that she was sick and that's why she can't come in that day. Then he made her, while again having knife on him, call Sarah's school. Sarah's school obviously also just understood, and they asked like, oh, is it the bug that's going around? Jill confirmed that that is the case. Then Jill was to go back upstairs, get herself ready and go outside to check for roadblocks and get the papers, and as she's doing that, he takes Richard downstairs so that Richard calls in sick again. His hands are tied behind his back, so here again Billy is the one holding the receiver and has the knife on him. With Richard, however, the receptionist was the one to pick up the first call that was made, and she kind of told his manager that he sounded odd, so the manager actually calls back. However, Richard picks up, tells him like he's just sick, so he's feeling off, and also they just keep chatting about business, and then they hang up, believing that Richard is going to return back to work the next day. And as Billy replaced the receiver on the cradle, the phone rang again. This would now be Jill's workplace, just calling back another person from her place, calling the landline, because again, mobile phones weren't a thing, just to check up on Jill. Richard says she's gonna be okay, she's just resting up, and he hangs up the phone. And this is where in my script I put have code words that can be used, emphasis on, real life conversations. Just anything that you would say in real life, have code words so that people at work or your loved ones or anybody knows if, God forbid, you're ever in any situation that is anything similar. If there's a creep following you on the street and you're on a friend with your phone, what are you telling them? How are you alerting them that you are in danger and that they should check up when you get home? Sorry, I get flustered, but have code words that can be used, like, as I'm saying, in real life situations. It's stuff that you say, we all have them, catchphrases, jargon, we all have it. We say it in almost all conversations that you have, especially on the phone. Think about them, what are they, and then if you don't say them, or if you say something else, but it's along the same line, but it's something else, somebody knows you're in danger, I need help, figure it out, and then have the contingency plan, what that person then needs to do. Are they calling the police? Who are they calling? Cool, cool. I'm so glad we had this talk. As Jill is out at the newsagents now, she will see headlines like "Dangerous hijacker still free despite Moorland hunt. Hostage fear among police theories." The theories that her and Billy would read from these newspapers, well, the first one was that the 30-year-old man is holding a family hostage in an isolated house on the moors. The second one, the second best theory that the police had, was that the man could be suffering from exposure or even be dead after the night on the snow-covered moors when temperatures plunged to 7 degrees below. Then there was a third and a fourth one, and creepily enough, the first one, as we know, will end up being true. Amy takes the papers, takes the different route back home, just as Billy expected that the police would not be there. And as she returns, she immediately looks towards the living room and spots that Arthur is not in his armchair any longer, and Billy lies to her saying that he's just in his room resting. So she offers up to make drinks for the whole family, takes them upstairs, and this is when she gets the chance to chat with Richard as well. Jill obviously made drinks for the whole family. However, Richard would be the one to take the drinks to Arthur and then to take Ribena for Sarah. So he is the one taking drinks for them. But Jill is extremely flustered, obviously, after having been under pressure the whole morning to call in sick for various people and then being on her mission to get the newspapers. So she's just happy to have some time to chat with her husband and her mom and to check up if they're all okay. After that, he brings Jill back to her bedroom, which is where he would proceed to rape her again. In the aftermath of the assault, Billy does the exact same thing. He goes to the guest room to talk to Richard, to build rapport. And at this point, again, this is speculation on my part based off of everything I know and hours of research on this story. He is so involved in this power trip. Like, the power trip of this man and this situation is what is so prevalent in this man's mind. After having assaulted, raped his wife in the bedroom that he should be sharing with her, he then proceeds to go speak to the husband who he had placed in the guest room, mind you, so that he feels like the man of the house. He is so involved in this to the point that he even forgets about Jill. He forgets to tie her up. So eventually, once she composes herself, she goes to the spare room and asks him if she should make food for the whole family. He tells her she can, and after the meal is ready, they go to the kitchen. When I say they, again here we're talking about Jill, about Amy, Richard, and Billy himself. He takes the plates, Billy that is, to Arthur and Sarah. Once he had taken the bowls, I think they were eating soup that evening, so he had taken the bowls of soup to Arthur and Sarah that he had said were both in the annex area, because again, it's, I think, easier for him to lie to the family if they're thinking that they're doing something relatable, right? It's like a grandchild and a granddad just watching TV in this annex area. This is what they remember them doing last, so he's going to say that that is where they are and that's what they're doing. And they're just so close by because the annex area is so close to the kitchen. And now that he has the family present at this table, he starts conjuring up a plan of escape. And they're like, okay, cool, we're listening, he's gonna get the fuck out of this house. So his plan is, he's looking at the map and trying to think where he needs to go. And his plan is, he has this buddy who he had committed crimes with before. So that buddy owes him money from like the previous job that they had done. He's gonna go get the money from this buddy. If he has to beat him up, he'll beat him up, doesn't matter. He's gonna get the money off of him. And then he's going to take Richard as a hostage, so that after he takes the money from the man, he can then just let Richard go and let him be in his car, and he's gonna like take over another person's car and take somebody else hostage. And then as he's sitting at that kitchen table downstairs, he's like, no, actually, Richard is not the one who's gonna go along with me. It's going to be Jill. She is, of course, extremely alarmed at this piece of information. She doesn't want to go and she starts becoming hysterical. She starts crying and protesting. So in order to calm her down, he gives her some whiskey. And now, in order to pass the time and also to keep everybody under control, he puts everybody in Sarah's room. He brings them all upstairs, and all of them are drinking whiskey. And that's kind of calming the situation down a little bit. But then he introduces some card games. Like, basically, he asks them if they have cards, and then all of them are just sitting around in, again, this weird, bizarre, stressful environment playing card games. I've seen that they have played Rumi, it's a card game, and just drinking whiskey, and they were playing supposedly for money. Everything is imaginary at this point. Everything is just something to do to pass the time before another part of this man's plan, who doesn't really seem to have a solid plan ahead. However, here, if you remember, they're all in Sarah's room, and that, in my opinion, again, is very much intentional, because it is them being in their daughter's room and their granddaughter's room when it comes to Amy that is keeping them all calm. They're all in the presence of this room, which has overpowering personality of a 10-year-old. And that prevents them all from noticing that the youngest and the oldest member of the family could not be heard, and have not been heard the whole day. There was no toilet flushing, there were no door creaks. After a few hours of this scenario inside of Sarah's room, Jill proposes to make a proper meal for the family, and Billy just accepts. Here, yet again, he brings the plates over to Arthur and Sarah to the annex area. And when he brings them back, Jill notices that her dad didn't touch any food. So she says, like, oh, just bring him back the dentures. Maybe that's why he didn't eat. So Billy does that. He brings the teeth and a bar of chocolate into that part of the house. When he returned, Jill faces him with a question that he did not expect to face. And that is that how come in all of these trips to Sarah, she hadn't asked last night and also today in the preparation for the evening for two things that she never went to bed without. One was her stuffed toy elephant, and the other one was this comfort towel. Her bedtime essentials. So Bill just says, no, she just didn't. So Jill asks him nicely to bring those two things to Sarah, and he does, and once he returned, he said she was really pleased to see them, and Jill just accepted that. Before they were to embark on this mission, actually around 4 p.m. that afternoon, there was another ringing from that phone that was in the main area of the house. And this was again somebody checking up on Richard from the company, yet again because these people were at their jobs every single day, so somebody was really worried that they were sick. However, here he asks Jill to pick the phone up. And as she does, she's just having this chat, trying to get them off the phone as soon as possible without raising any alarms. This man on the phone asks before hanging up, have you heard about the loony on the loose? And Jill froze at this moment because Billy was standing right next to her. He had heard every word. So she just says, like, I must go. I've got so much to do. I'm just going to say goodbye. And Billy loses it as soon as she hangs up that phone. She says, loony, why did he call me that? I'm not crazy. And Jill just tries to pacify him, tries to calm him down, saying like, it's all lies, Billy, it's all lies. In order to calm down, Jill, in the pitch darkness of the house, just looks outside of the window and she notices that the snow just kept falling and still had not stopped the whole day. And she notices Billy breathing behind her neck, saying how this goes into his favor, because they're never going to track him now. By this time, Billy had been getting news from the papers that he had read that Jill had brought home. However, nobody switched on the television. Nobody really suggested it, because that might draw attention from any neighbors nearby, or it's just too bright, or it might trigger Billy. I actually have no idea, like you let me know, beyond the noise levels, why Billy, who is so full of himself but also wants to know what the police knows on him, had apparently never switched on the TV during those couple of days. But during this day, the police search obviously proceeded. They have deployed helicopters in the morning. They have been doing door-to-door searches. And they decided to basically issue a press conference. They were having interviews at those points, and they said, like, this is a dangerous individual. Yes, he will definitely be able to put up a fight and injure somebody. The questions they kind of tried to avoid, and they're saying, like, there's more investigation to be done, were obviously around how did somebody like Billy Hughes get a hold of the knife.
Now, a lot of people are asking where he got the knife from in the first place.
That remains to be found out yet. One can speculate as to how the man came by the knife. But really, I'm not competent to speak about the prison side of it. That is down to them.
They would give the politically correct answers of this being the prison side of things, that is down to them, that they're not competent to speak on that issue, and that remains to be found out. While that is happening, while the interviews are taking place at Pottery Cottage around 7:30, Billy decides it is time for the trial run at getting away. So the trial run included Jill, Richard and Billy going to the usual petrol spot and just making sure that the car is full, that the tank of the car is full. Then they return to the house and he realizes, okay, there are no roadblocks in the area, there's no danger in that imminent area. And when they do, this is when Billy mentions his daughter, yet again, just to reassure Jill that everything is gonna be okay. He apparently even had taken like a handful of letters that were from Nicola with like childish doodles, he passed them around, and he's doing all of this yet again in Sarah's room as they're just drinking tea. And it gave Jill the fresh hope for her own daughter's safety. Straight after this moment of normalcy, straight after doing this and appearing calm, he goes back to the planning mode. He ties back Amy and Richard in Sarah's room. He goes to Richard's room, well, rather Richard and Jill's room, and takes a suitcase, presumably to fill it up with money from this body, and then takes one of Richard's suits. He puts them in the back of the car, and then him and Jill are just off. As their neighbors, the Newmans, went outside to clear the driveway from snow to be ready for the next day, they spot nothing out of the ordinary when it comes to Pottery Cottage. And this is when around 10 p.m. Jill and Billy emerge. They sit in this car, obviously Billy is driving, Jill is just in the passenger seat, and sort of halfway through this journey, Jill has obviously no idea where the hell they're going. Billy decides to turn the car back and he says, like, we must go back to the Pottery Cottage. We must go back for these letters, because apparently he forgot the address as to where he's going in the first place, and he has a set of letters that have this address on them. And Jill is hysterical at this point because she thinks, like, oh my god, what if, like, my family actually managed to, like, get out of their bounds in the room and now he's going to harm them. Once they park up at the Pottery Cottage, Jill offered up to go get his letters because she thought, like, okay, I might actually be able to sneak into that annex and check up on my dad and on my daughter and figure out what's going on, like that they're not all harmed. However, Richard would be the one to go in, and apparently he found the letters and he put them back into his jacket, and he's now back in the car driving to this location. On this ride to his friend's house, Billy is not shutting the hell up. He's talking about the crimes that him and his friend had committed as if Jill gives a fuck. He's talking about all of the ways of how he would kill a person, how he would slit a throat. This is how people do it. This is the stories that he heard in prison. This is how he would do it. And Jill just says, like, everything went from one ear to the other. She just, like, tried to disconnect. And as soon as he kept his mouth shut, she tried to offer up an idea. Like, Billy, what if now you go, you get that money, you have the suitcase, you have the suit, you then leave me the car, I'll go back to the Pottery Cottage, I will not alert the police, you have seen us, you know that we are calm, we would not let anybody know. You just go to like a car park or something, steal somebody else's car, and you're on the run. Like, they will never find you because they don't know where you are, like they don't know whose car you have taken. And he seems to go along with the story, but then he offers up kind of like an alternative, right? No, what I would do is I would just go into someone else's car, stop them, on the side of the road, not even stop them, but people these days, they don't lock their back doors to the car. So I'm just going to jump in through the back door and then use my knife to threaten them and hold another person hostage. And Jillian at this point is just terrified. Terrified at the prospect that this man might hold another family, another person, anybody else hostage, and that she had sort of inserted a version, at least, of this idea in his mind. As they finally make it to this destination, that was actually supposed to be a cafe that was run by Billy's mate called Roy. But the place wasn't a cafe after all, and I don't think that Jill really knew where they were going. I don't think that he had shared the details of the plan. She only knew he was going to his friend's house and he was to take money from him because he owed him money. She didn't know how he was going to take money, she didn't know anything. She just stayed in the passenger seat there as Billy proceeded to open up the gate to what was somebody's house. And after a couple of minutes, which must have felt like forever, Billy gets out and he's running, he's legging it. He's going into the driver's seat of that car and just passes this police truncheon, like the police head, to Jill as a souvenir because he had just apparently knocked down the police officer. And he just keeps driving home, and Jill is trying to get the information out of this man as to what had just happened. Billy tells her the story about how there was a cafe there, even though clearly there wasn't, and how he was just snooping around trying to knock on the door, and the policeman was in the area and he was lurking around asking him what he's doing there. So of course he had to run, he had to knock down this police officer, and he took that cap as a souvenir and he gave it to Jill as a present. And then he kind of kept repeating this story for his own, I don't know, power trip. I don't know what he was doing it for, because the story obviously wasn't true. This man did live there. There's no explanation to the connection with Billy, how he knew of this address. And again, going into Billy's favor of just causing havoc and horror when it comes to this family, this man kept the police truncheon like as protection. So he had that sort of like in front of his door with a dog leash. So Billy just saw that and was like, oh, I'm going to invent this whole story to petrify this woman even further of how dangerous I am and how I will just stop at nothing in order to knock down the police officers and anybody in my way. Once again, when he let off the steam, he invented a couple of stories and just repeated this one a few times. Jill jumps in and says like, okay, once we are back, then, because apparently this plan isn't going through, is it? You're not just letting me go back to my family while you take somebody else's car because you don't have the money now, do you? Well, what about if I were to go and sleep with Sarah, like she must be missing me? To which Billy just responds, leave things as they are. As Jill and Billy return home and they're having the hot beverages inside of Sarah's room, Jill suggests another idea. Maybe he finally accepts this one. And that idea was that everybody sleeps in Sarah's room that evening. They had some sleeping bags and she can just take them out and Billy can take the bed. Her and Richard and Amy will be on the floor. And he accepts this idea. Obviously, everybody's easier to control if they're all in the same room and they might get some sleep as well. But from Jill's perspective, again, personal opinion, she wanted to feel safer with the whole family near her, to know that everybody is actually in the same room. However, also she would do anything at this point not to be left with Billy alone when it comes to just horror that she was experiencing, but also she could not stomach the thought of being assaulted. It's actually assaulted by this man again. As they're sleeping through the night, so Richard and Jill are on the floor as well as Amy is, and they're just kind of speaking in muffled voices and then trying to fall asleep, they hear some commotion from downstairs. So fearing for Sarah and Arthur's safety, Jill decides to wake Billy up, who goes downstairs, obviously with a knife and armed, and checks up and comes back upstairs and says, oh, it was just the dogs, like having their tails bang on the door. It was just the dogs making all of the noise. So in this just shock and terror, the whole family spends the second night under the same roof with their attacker. On the morning of Friday, January the 14th, 1977, he wakes up Gillian in order to prepare tea and toast for everybody, and he will take the plates to Arthur and to Sarah. And this is when he directs Jill and Richard, telling them that he is going to send them on another mission. Like, he wants papers, but he also has like a whole shopping list that he wants on this occasion. He needs a gas camping stove, the saucepan, like multiple tins of different soups, also like some whiskey, the packets of the cigarettes that he smokes, and all of the newspapers, locals and nationals. He gives them their own money, BTW. He gives them like 25 pounds of their own money, which at that time was enough to buy everything that he wants, and on top of that to buy a gift for Sarah, like a little book or whatever they find at the grocery store. And he trusts them to go on their own because he has the rest of their family, including their daughter, hostage. As they went to the shops, all of the shop assistants would later be interviewed, and they would say that the two of them appeared completely normal. They got a gift for their little girl, and they just would get like all of the papers. But like, a lot of people go into the shops and just get multiple papers. People don't really find that to be that suspicious, especially if there's somebody on the run. Like, if you have a potential killer on the loose, you will want to know all of the pieces of information on that person. And this is where Jill and Richard would actually have the advantage here, because not only could they have alerted somebody, could have actually escaped, could have gone to the police, could have driven right into the police station, but also they would be the first ones to see the newspaper articles. So Jill here does that. She opens the Derbyshire Times, and she realizes that the police has actually been searching, sort of going towards Pottery Cottage. So they have been going towards that direction. And she panics, thinking, well, what if while we were out, the police is already at the house? Like, what if they had surrounded it? What would Billy actually do to the rest of the family? So once they rush home, Gillian jumps out of the car because she notices a note on the door. And the note says, "Gone next door, Billy and Mom." And she spots Amy and Billy coming from next door because Billy had another genius plan of how to get money, and it would be to rob the people next door that were out, basically. They weren't even, I think I mentioned in part one, living there. Like, the house was sold, so it was empty. I don't know what his mindset was. At this point, he's irrational and he's just all over the place. They go back in. Jill makes the food, makes the tins of soup and stuff that she brought, and he again brings them towards the annex area. And as he returns, Jill yet again asks him quite a posing question. How come that Sarah, for now 2 nights, didn't ask for a pair of clean underwear? Like, she's quite a clean girl, she cares about the cleanliness. How come that she has never asked to change her clothes, just in general? So he dismisses it, but offers to bring her a pair of clean underwear. And when he returns, he says, like, yeah, she was thankful, but of course she asked him to turn around as she changed. And Jill was satisfied as she could be with that answer, knowing that that is exactly what Sarah would have done. And he even told her that she got the radio on, and Jill, yet again, believed him. After they finish their food, they all go back to Sarah's room, and this is when Billy asks if they have a wig. He actually proposed this idea the day before, and Jill was kind of not willing to like share her wig. She had a wig, but she really was attached to it, so she didn't really want to share a wig with him, but like, what can you do? So he wanted to be more unrecognizable, so she put a wig on. I believe she even cut it for him so that it looks better, and all of them were kind of saying like, oh no, yeah, you look like you're a different person. This is when he decides finally that he has enough power over this family to actually take a bath as they're all sitting inside of Sarah's room. He would also go with this wig on to the annex area to apparently amuse Sarah, and then he would go back to Sarah's room and tell the rest of the family how Sarah had said how the wig looked nice on him. At this point, everybody really wanted him out, and they knew that crucial part of his plan was to get the money. So he starts chatting with them and rather demanding now from Richard, like, he has basically taken all of the options into account, right? He went to his buddy and couldn't get the money that way. He tried to rob the place next door. There was no money there. So the next thing to do is to wait for nightfall and then to go to Richard's firm. So he was asking him, like, is there any money stashed there? And Richard tells him there is a safe box, like a safety box inside of his office in Bread Plastics, which is where he worked. So they all wait for around 7:30 p.m. for the night shift to be on and for like everybody that knew Richard basically to have left his workplace. They go to Richard's workplace, he opens up the safety box for them, and Billy manages to take 210 pounds, which in today's money is around 1,400 pounds. So he got quite a lot of money for that amount of time if he was to actually go on a run. And during this time, he's quite impatient, but also just losing a sense of like what's important and just completely irrational in terms of just how quickly he wants to get out of there and how he's not really thinking sensibly, because he even dropped the knife like among all of the papers and the banknotes, and then he realized, and then he was like manically looking for it. And now the plan continues. He is to return everybody to the Pottery Cottage, tie up Amy and Richard, but he would make sure to tell them that this is one last time that he is tying them up. Then he's gonna go into the car with Jill and basically hold her hostage until he finds another car that he is to rob. He was to rob another car and just to then take that driver possibly hostage, or just to take their money and take their car. And then Jill was to be left in the family vehicle, the Chrysler that they have had, to return home to the family. So reluctantly, Jill jumped into the car with him, believing that this nightmare will finally be over. However, she was in a car with Billy Hughes. So, of course, as this man is so unpredictable at this point, as they're driving towards Chesterfield area, he just remembers that he had forgotten a map. This map that he had been marking, and he was to use this map to find his way out of the town, and he had forgotten it at Pottery Cottage. And at this point, she can't even reason with him because she knows he is just going to return back home. And as he does that and he parks up at the Pottery Cottage, he just tells her to go into the driver's seat, right, in order to direct the car towards the street so that when he gets out, basically as soon as he changes into the suit and as soon as he finds this map, he was supposed to change into Richard's suit for, again, whatever reason, so that he appears like a decent human being to somebody else that he was to take hostage, so that the car is pointing to the street, he can jump into the car and they can immediately get out. And as she does that, and as she's waiting for him in the driver's seat now, he runs out, she moves towards the passenger seat, and he tries to start up the car again. However, the car won't budge. The car just refused to move. Can you tell that I'm not a driver? The car won't move. The ignition won't start. Whatever the wording is. Obviously, Billy is pissed. He is losing his mind. He's giving all sorts of different orders, like go next door, go find a neighbor, go pull over somebody else who has a car, go steal a car, literally like everything under the sun. And then finally he tells her, just go next door and make up a good story. Tell them something like about your friend being in the hospital and how you need to get her husband there. So Jill does what she's told, and at around 7 p.m. that evening, the Newmans are just listening to the evening program as they hear the bell ring. And Len, the husband, actually comes to the door and he hears it's Jill outside. So he just looks at her and she gives him the excuse, and he asks, oh, where is Rich? Like, why is Rich not doing this, basically? And this is when Jill whispered to him, he's tied up in a chair, you know. So Len just asks her, like, are you drunk? Like, are you okay? What's up? And she whispers back at him, it's the man from the moors. He's listening. He'll kill us all. Finally, Len understood, and he went back in with his wife to basically tell her about the situation. And the wife here, Joyce, decided to follow them in the car. So obviously Jill, in order not to make Billy suspect anything, returns back to him, and they're just waiting and waiting and waiting as Joyce and Len are trying to conjure up a plan. Because Len is thinking like, well, I need to arm myself and then I'm gonna take the car out of the garage and go to them, and then Joyce is just going to follow us, but like how does she follow us without alerting anybody? And as that's happening, Billy's getting increasingly paranoid, and he's just saying like, you have told them. She's just saying like, I have not told them a single thing. And Jill would say this is the only time that she had actually lied to him, and obviously for her own sake. As this is happening, however, in the house, because the Newmans lived quite close, almost next door to them, as they're trying to conjure up the plan of like how they are gonna follow him, they spot Amy coming from the side of the Pottery Cottage, bleeding out from her neck. And she's trying to whisper Len towards the neighbors, and they're now confused as to like what is happening. But Amy still has enough strength to kind of just walk and just sit up by this wall. And this wall is visible also now to Jill and to Billy. And Jill finally spots her mom. And before Billy even had the time to react, something registered in her head. It registered that her mom is hurt. She didn't know to what degree, because it was still like in the distance, as in like it was like a side door to the house. But she just knew that her mom had been hurt. But Billy was quick enough and he managed to bring Amy inside of the house. He will tell Jill that he left her on the living room floor. We'll find out later that he just brought her into the garage. But Jill's mind at this point is racing. But this would be the moment when Billy lost the power over one of his hostages. As Billy is taking Amy inside, Jill has the time to actually take a glance at what would be Arthur's window, her dad's window, and she realizes she had not seen the light there in 3 days. However, she's still not processing, and Billy will make sure that she doesn't have enough time to do that. He now gets out of the house and he's like, fuck it, we're not waiting for the neighbors because, you know, he thinks that she told them. And they are now on foot. They're jumping over fences in the snow, in the weather that's like under 0 degrees Celsius. He's, every time that they spot a car, putting her head into a ditch. So like basically they're dunking down so that the cars don't spot them. She thought like, if I don't die by the hand of this man, I will die of hypothermia. Like, we're just dunking down in ditches, they're exhausted, they're dirty, like filthy, they look like a mess. And this is when Billy makes another super rational decision. Them looking this way are going to go to another random neighbor's house. Again, this house just materialized itself and he was already fed up, he needed another car. So he tells her to go to this house, and this house was owned by the Frosts, and think of another excuse, like how their car is stuck and they just need a tow. Knocking on this door, what Billy didn't know is that Jill was known by this pair of neighbors as well. So her knocking on their door in this state of just being dirty from like lying inside of the ditches and just completely disheveled with a man who was not her husband would raise significant alarms. As they go in, also, Jill makes eye contact with Mrs. Frost. Her name is Madge. There are women in this case that are just absolute fucking legends. Thank fuck we're women in this case. And she manages to just whisper when he wasn't looking, "Help me." So Madge immediately registered, and she was also scared for her husband's well-being, but like he was the one to offer to actually use his truck to tie the rope and then help their Chrysler out of the Pottery Cottage. So with the van now, they go back, and the husband here would actually say, so the neighbor, he would actually say how he at first was confused, right? Like, yes, Jill is there with somebody who is not her husband, and like both of them look distressed. But by the time that they actually made it to the cottage and he helped them get the car out, he was almost just convinced that this man was no harm to Jill. Like, this couldn't be the man on the loose. Like, what are we even talking about? Like, he's completely calm and relaxed and in control of the whole situation. Luckily though, Mrs. Frost and also Mrs. Newman were quite clued up. So Joyce Newman was the one who had actually called the police, and then Madge was just about to, or I think she might have as well, but by the time that the two of them, Billy and Jill, were in that car rushing away from the Pottery Cottage, the police was already there. There are certain gaps in this story that I haven't found the answers to in the book or online. One of them actually I haven't mentioned, and happened on the morning of the Friday, because nobody mentions that they had called in sick again when it comes to Sarah, or also when it comes to their workplaces. And that might be because they didn't, or it might be just that it's a forgotten detail in the haze of like other events that have been happening. However, then there's another gap, and that is here, because from my understanding, like now the Frosts and the Newmans were all around Pottery Cottage. Yet again, the police decided to ask who was there. They weren't basically getting the information that Billy is already on the run with Gillian. Rather, they're there at the Pottery Cottage trying to figure out if anybody is still there, and only then do they find out that actually somebody had helped them out and that they're now on the run again. So here at the Pottery Cottage now, they start knocking, asking if anybody's there, and they just hear like all of the pets making sounds from the inside. All of the pets, from what I have seen, have survived, just FYI, because I know some people are very about knowing if the pets have been okay, but what they're gonna find once they break inside of that house through a window and then open up the door will scar so many people for life. Upstairs, Richard Moran was lying face down on the carpet, head against the chest of drawers. He almost managed to get from his bounds and work himself free, however, there wasn't enough time. Downstairs, in the living room, the police will find Arthur Minton, who is laying on his back next to the long orange curtains. On the floor next to him was the untouched food that Billy used to bring for him and for Sarah. Following the clear signs of disturbance against the wooden floors of the garage, the police moved there next, and this is where they would find the body of Amy Minton, face down beside the wall with her right arm outstretched. Moving into the annex, the police officers entered the Minton's bedroom and stopped at the door. This is the part that made me sob, so just an FYI if you don't want to listen to it, I think everybody knows what's coming. 10-year-old Sarah Moran was lying in fetal position on her grandparents' green carpet. She was curled between the double bed and an armchair, and her wrists and ankles were also tied with softer material than flax, but secured with force. She was also gagged, and the fabric was just knotted under her blonde ponytail. Next to Sarah, tucked up in an old pillowcase for a bed, was her favorite doll that slept soundly, which was Sarah's last act before being murdered. At this point, the police knew that they had 4 victims inside, and they realized pretty quickly that Amy and Richard died last, that their wounds to the neck have been inflicted last in the next possible couple of hours. So basically when Richard went back in, apparently to change into the suit and to get the map, this is when he finally killed Richard and Amy. However, what they also realized, and that was later confirmed, was that Sarah and Arthur died in the first couple of hours since Billy actually entered the Pottery Cottage. All of them died by the wounds inflicted to their neck area with that knife that he was carrying around. The crime scene photographer would actually say that this scene gave him nightmares for years to come, especially Sarah, how she had been found, and also how she had been held, because up until that point, you're kind of led to believe with this book, and just like how the story had been told, that at least he wouldn't harm the child, that at least he wouldn't bound and gag a 10-year-old, and then just all of those illusions are just dispersed by the police and how they found this crime scene. But now the chase and the pursuit of Billy begins. And some people would probably summarize this chase in about 2 minutes. I'm going to spend a bit more time on that, just because it's not... You really need to understand how long this had gone for and how, again, bizarre the police work was at the time. Let's just call it that. Because everybody kind of tapped themselves on the shoulder after this and in the aftermath of 1977 and this event. And I'm like, should we? Should we be? Because just in terms of distance, because obviously I found locations in this book and then had to look it up, between the location where his car will finally be stopped one last time, because there's a first part and the second part of this pursuit, there will be a 40-minute, and that's just ride, that's just the drive for a car. So as I'm saying, there's a first part of this pursuit and the second part of this pursuit, because the police figured out, because of Mr. Frost and like where he said the car went, and also the motorway being close by and Billy obviously wanting to escape the town, that he is headed towards M6. And they found the car pretty quickly. Like, they located Gillian and Billy in this Chrysler in the family car pretty quickly. However, then during the first part of the pursuit, they're trying to put roadblocks, they're trying to put like the police cars basically for him to have to swerve and hit the car. But he just doesn't. He just pushes through and just drives forward, even though the police is doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? Like when they put the police cars and try to block off the area so that he can't actually pass by, he still passes by, hits all of the cars, does not give a fuck. It would only be when they reach the roundabout that the first part of the pursuit will end. And this is because after the roundabout, so he couldn't see, right, around the corner, that there was the unmanned police car. And as he was trying to swerve past it, he hit into the bollards area, so into the sidewalk, and then hit the wall. And he's trying to use the axe, because he had brought the axe from the Pottery Cottage to smash the windscreen, but it just doesn't work. This man can't man an axe. He can't use an axe, as you're gonna find out soon. Luckily, because this case could have ended so much worse somehow. So he's trying to get out of the car and realizes he can't, but he realizes Gillian is still there. Neither of them is completely harmed, so again he's going to use Gillian as his bargaining card. Knife to her throat, he gets Jill outside of the car. The police is surrounding this roundabout at this moment in time. However, because he has the leverage, he convinces them to basically move himself and Gillian towards the marina, which was the typical police car at the time that had the tank full of petrol, and the two of them are now in the second car, and the second part of the pursuit of chase of Billy Hayes continues. That's why I'm saying this is just something else, because the police just lets him take the hostage yet again into another vehicle, and then the pursuit continues. And at this point we are going to the second part. I will put the map up on the screen, because according to the book, everything started in Eastmoor, right? Pottery Cottage is in Eastmoor area. And where Billy would eventually finally be stopped and hit another wall would be near Hayfield. So this is, even if this was just to be like a chill car ride, it would take about 40 minutes. So this pursuit is taking for over an hour at this point. And during that second leg of the journey is when the police officers on the scene finally call up a man called Peter House, who was the chief inspector at the time. At this point, near Whaley Bridge, once he passed yet another roadblock that they have set up, a police officer was told to stop him at all costs. So in the tiny village of Reno, there was another officer that was setting up a roadblock. And they knew that they had a matter of minutes to set this up, to set this scene up, and then basically fly for cover. Run for cover, run for cover. They're not flying, Maya, they're humans. So what he did is he stopped this bus. This guy's name was Eric Harris. He would also be commended for his work later. So he got the bus driver's attention. He got everybody who was on that bus to get out and immediately find shelter. And then he took this bus and positioned it horizontally on the road. And then on the other road, so like on where Billy was basically to drive through, they would set up the police accident sign. So one of those blue signs, it's like, oh, road work, so that he had to swerve into the area where the bus was, and the only way to avoid that bus was to go onto the sidewalk and basically hit another wall and stop the car. And as predicted, because this is a matter of minutes, Billy did just that. Inside of that marina, Jill Moran lifted her head. Slowly, she opened her eyes and realized that suddenly there were policemen all around. I cannot imagine how relieved you would feel at that very moment after being stuck with this man for 55 hours, and then some on top of that as he's driving around, as there's a whole pursuit, as there's a chase, as this guy is unpredictable inside of that car. And then you realize that he is still inside of that same car with you. Luckily, neither Jill nor Billy were hurt at this time, but the car was clearly not in the driving condition, and there was no other car to bargain for, so that meant that Billy and his hostage were trapped. At this point, House made it to the location, and he knew the only thing he had to do, as Billy was now outside of the car and also with his ex threatening to harm Jill, was to bring him to a calm state. So he starts that off. He is not a negotiator, by the way. Like, House was not a hostage negotiator. I don't think he was ever in his career. However, he was the chief inspector, so he was the police's best bet in this circumstance. He knew that Jill might have developed Stockholm syndrome at this point, that she will go along with whatever he says. So when Billy would scream, like, I have an axe and I have a knife, like, Jillian would, next to him, Jill, would be like, well, you don't have a knife. And so, like, I have a knife or you die. And then she would obviously, like, scream and be hysterical and kind of reinforce the fact that, like, he is dangerous, he is harming her, like, he's about to kill her, so that nobody approaches them, so that he is safe. Billy's main goal here was obviously to get himself another vehicle, to get out of this situation in a way where he's gonna escape with the money and make it to the motorway and then be out. And for Jill to obviously go into that car with him, and then he will let her out somewhere eventually. And for Peter, what was important was to keep Jill safe, and there was no way in his mind that he's going to let them go into yet another car, yet another vehicle. But also calm him down, distract him enough with the way that he chats, and distract him from this idea of like a vehicle for long enough for him to think of a plan of attack, but also in order for him to offer himself up, right? Like, leave Jill alone. Like, I'm a police officer, like, everybody is going to protect you as long as I am with you. So this is how he's going to try to reason with him. Some of the tactics that he deployed to level with Billy, well, at first, because again, he's not a hostage negotiator, never was, he tried to level with him being like, think about your wife, like Billy's wife, Jean, and your daughter, Nicola. And then about Jean, he would say, like, I don't care about her. House, realizing this is a wrong approach, then said, okay, you don't care about her, but you care about Jillian. She had taken care of you for like the past 3 days. You sure don't want to harm her. He tried to build rapport with Billy by telling him he is from a mill town so that he knows, like, he's not pretentious. When Billy asked, like, what his rank is, he told him he's chief inspector, and that made Billy feel, like, huge self-importance. Like, oh my god, there's a chief inspector that was woken up at this time to go and, like, save the day, and, like, I am of that importance that the chief inspector is here for me. And also, what House tried to convince him, like, I mean, let's just go to a pub, talk this over a pint, and then how do you think, like, this will end. You will end up in prison, but if you surrender now, you might be let out one day. And Billy knew, and he said immediately, I'm not going back to prison. I'll take all the bastards with me when I go before that happens. And he was right. Brady and Hindley crimes had already taken place, and there was the whole unspoken conversation between Billy and House at that moment in time, because both of them had the knowledge about what Billy had done in that cottage, and that if he was to walk into the prison again, he would not come out of there alive because he killed a 10-year-old girl. House was certain that the 10-year-old girl whose body had been found bound and gagged in her grandparents' bedroom was Jill's daughter. The two men understood each other, but Hughes had no reason to fear House might speak of the murders. He had no intention of doing so for Jill's sake. The conversation goes on into House trying to build further rapport with him by saying how his childhood was tough and how like his dad used to beat him up. And this is the first time, unless I have skipped like some pages of this book, which I don't think I have, where this is relatable to Billy because his father also beat him up. So this is why House, having that knowledge from his previous record, had used this. And this is basically just a paragraph, like nobody really goes back to it and nobody from what I have seen mentioned it before. So could it be the case that both of these individuals, but rather House was building rapport, so like that Billy hated his own dad, that he considered him a hard bastard, that he was beating the family as a child, and that is why Billy had displayed such violence through his crimes, through his teenagehood, onto his grown-ass life? Possibly, could be, but we will never know. As the conversation is going along, and just as House is making progress and getting him to give up Jillian for a car, the lights on a nearby house go on. And suddenly, Billy realizes his surroundings, and he realizes there are two officers that are crouched down. So he goes berserk. He tells House to call it all off. He tells him that, like, none of the plan is gonna go forward again. To do his bidding, the car needs to face the street, and he wants cigarettes on top of that. Put it all in the car, and then, like, we can talk again. Luckily for Billy, he didn't realize that the two officers that were crouching down, were holding shotguns. So now House takes the opportunity to get the ciggies to stage everything. So he goes back, and the bus is still in the area, right? Like the bus that was used as decoy. So he manages to get like some protection and for Billy not to see what he's actually doing. So he has a chat with the firearm officers, briefing them to be in the position close to the driver's side of the car. And Billy, in the meantime, thinks that he's calling everything off, that he's gonna tell them to fuck off. He then went to the other officers outlining his plan. When Billy was to move towards the car, the other marina car that he was to take, he will no doubt use Jill as his shield. And this is when House is going to try to free her. They all agreed the best chance of saving her life was by getting her out of the car. After the staging, now returning to Billy, as we know, this man is unpredictable as hell, and he is now spooked. He wants all of the lights on, and he is asking for different things, like cigarettes are not enough. Just as we know, like, like he would be stuck in a car with Jillian and then be like, oh my god, I forgot the letters, oh my god, I forgot the map. So this time he wants size 8 shoes from an officer. So there was an officer who took their boots off, and this is snow, right? They're left in their socks. So there's another humiliation part for Billy here as well that he must have been getting off on. And then for all of the items to be dropped in the back seat of the car, in front of which he is with the hostage. Yes, so like it's the same car where he wants things dropped off. And House obviously uses this as an excuse to be now closer to them. This is when he asks him to put like all of the lights on, so House knows that he's about to do something. Like, this is a man that at this point has been spooked. He's asking about random things. Even though he had never been a hostage negotiator, he knows that this means he is ready to pounce. Jill at this moment realizes that as well. She becomes hysterical and she starts pleading with him. And at this point, the relationship as hostage and a captor between the two of them had reached the breaking point. About 50 minutes into the negotiation, Billy lost control. After the threats towards Jill, he did what he had done so many times in his life. He blamed somebody else for his own problems. He screamed at Jill, "It's your fucking fault." He then turned to House, saying that he is too close. House responded, "Just release her, Billy." And this is when Billy, instead of that, snapped, shouting, "Your time is up," and swinging the axe at Jill. Luckily here the axe landed on its side rather than on its blade, but this is then when a lot of actions took place at the same time. House also went in between, like, basically to shield Jill, so again swinging with an axe he hit House, again luckily somehow on the side that just wasn't sharp, and at this point the shots started being fired. The first bullet penetrated Billy's scalp, the second one went through his shoulder, and then the third one went through the windscreen. There was a crack as the bullet left a starburst in the glass on the fatal trajectory, because at this point Billy Hughes was laying down in front of that Marina car, dead. At 11:10 p.m. he was driven from the scene in the ambulance, and once they reached the West Park Hospital in Macclesfield, 28-year-old William Thomas Hughes was pronounced dead on arrival. Jill was also transported to the hospital herself, and she didn't ask them the only question that mattered because she knew they were not allowed to tell her. As she was put to sleep, at Pottery Cottage they went to preserve the bodies and transport them to the mortuary. Colleagues of Richard were called to identify the bodies, and then there was a friend that was to identify Jill's side of the family. And finally, once Jill woke up the next day in the hospital, if she slept at all, after what she had lived through, the superintendent came by her bedside. The nurse brought him a chair, and Jill listened as he told her everything, measuring out his sentences as if each one bore its own weight and had to be carefully balanced. When he had finished speaking, she said steadily, "There's no one left then." The superintendent reached for her hand and said in a voice thick with emotion, "No, love, no one." After her release from the hospital, Jill would stay with her friends for a couple of days. And in her lifetime, from what I had seen, she had spoken about these events and what had happened inside of the Pottery Cottage to two people. Rather, one of them was Daily Mail, so there was issues of Daily Mail that would subsequently release her story, sort of like chapter by chapter for a couple of releases, and the second was Peter House. From what I have read, and this would be one of the last pieces of information in this case, Jill since then had not spoken about the events. And I'm not sure whether or not House asked her for the permission to share her story. This is something that I would have probably liked to know at like the beginning of the book, meaning like, is it alright to share a story like this with the public? But she had shared it with House, so we are to believe that what he had put into the book is the real account of events. So with the pets, she had stayed at the friend's house. So with the pets, Jill had stayed at a friend's house up until the funeral, which took place on Friday, 21st of January 1977. She had deliberately specified the dimensions of the 4 caskets should be the same, saying that she didn't think she could bear if Sarah's casket was smaller than the others. Before the funeral took place, and just as Billy Hughes' cremation did, there was a farmer that was inspecting the fields of Eastmoor, and as he did, he found a folder. There was a magistrate's court warrant dated 12th of January 1977. So as he handed those over to the police, 130 officers appeared on the location. The search went on until an officer made a discovery in a field near the dry stone wall on the main road. A black-handled knife, rusted from exposure but still bearing its deadly blade. It lay some 300 yards from Pottery Cottage. Subsequent forensic examination established beyond doubt that the knife was that reported missing on 3rd of December 1976 from the kitchens of Leicester prison. To wrap this up on Billy, and then we can continue with the aftermath of this story, when the women in the area found out that he was to actually be buried in the same cemetery where the victims would have been buried, there were huge protests. There was some footage actually of the women filling up the grave that was supposed to be for Billy. Because of this, his body had to actually be cremated. However, due to the protests at the cemetery, the funeral for Billy Hughes had to actually be diverted to the chapel and the crematorium as those of his 4 victims. Jean and Nicola were the only people to attend Billy's funeral, and the way Jean viewed it is that attending the funeral had been the hardest thing she ever had to do. She said she used to love Billy, but she doesn't now, and she should never forgive him for what he did, but she believes he was ill and needed help, and that the system failed Billy Hughes. I feel after you finish the rest of the part 2, you will, I think either at this point you see that the system failed Billy, that the system failed the family, or that blaming it on the system just isn't enough. I don't know which option you will feel most inclined to by the end of this video. I am, as you will see, most inclined towards the very last one. So, moving on from Billy Hughes, Jilly, as I mentioned, would tell this story twice. She doesn't answer the question that is on so many people's minds in either of those accounts, and that is the question of why did Jill and her husband fail to raise the alarm, having been given so many chances. According to most of the people, they believe that Jillian didn't know that her family had been killed. She thought that they were still alive. She thought they would be the hostage to this lunatic and that he would let the family go if she just went along with it. In 1977, there were a few other things that happened, because obviously an investigation had to be launched into this case. So there were 2 inquiries and an inquest. So inquiries are done by the courts in order for them to see like, oh, how could have this been prevented? What can we introduce now? Can we maybe charge some individuals? No, that last part never fucking happens. So there was an inquiry into Leicester prison, which is where Billy escaped from. And the report concluded, where is this sad part of the story? The primary failure in respect of the escape of Hughes concerned the searching procedures within the prison, where management and staff failed to coordinate or pursue with sufficient vigor the search for a boning knife which had been reported missing, as we know, over a month before he actually escaped. Information conveyed to the prison authorities from the police and other agencies when Hughes was first received was insufficient to identify him as a person prone to extreme violence or as a potentially dangerous psychopath. So their recommendation after these reports were that the frequency of his appearances in court was deemed to be excessive and hazardous to security. And most bizarrely here, because they obviously had to look into multiple people when it comes to why these reports never reached the prison. Did they reach the prison? Why did the prison not deem him to be dangerous? Why? They actually interviewed a senior medical officer who concluded there was nothing in Billy Hughes' past history which could be construed as likely to herald the enormity of the offenses of which he was later found guilty. He then further said this man appears from the records to have been an inadequate, antisocial, unstable, irresponsible, and unscrupulous individual. But again, nothing warranted for them to think that he was escalating towards, I don't know, he was already committing serious crimes. So, I don't know how people did things back then, but apparently nothing warranted for them and the intelligence that they had on this man to actually prevent him from being transported to courts this often, for people to search his cell maybe for a whole month until they find the boning knife that he had hidden. Yep. So these inquiries resulted in 17 recommendations aimed at reducing the risk of prisoners' ability to leave prison to be implemented immediately. The reports concluded there have been errors of judgment in the Hughes' case, but none of were grounds for considering disciplinary action. These were failures of the system rather than of particular individuals. Trust that I'm using that tone of voice because I will return to this particular part of the case. But now the inquest takes place, and the inquest is there to interview everybody but Jill, really, but mostly the police officer and House and the police officers that shot the guns, because here in the UK, as majority of you know, like, guns are only used in exceptional circumstances. Like, it has to be borderline terrorist attack, and it was even worse back then. They had to get approved for these two officers to actually have the police guns on them, so they had to justify their actions for using these guns. And here there was the jury of all men who, after hearing all of the evidence, returned a verdict of justifiable homicide. Where is this case now, or rather where did it go beyond the year 1977? Peter House helped Jill with her recovery, and he was also awarded the Queen's Commendation for Brave Conduct in December of 1977 for his actions in Reino. When he was asked what would have happened if Jill Moran had been killed and Hughes had survived, he said that would have been a different story. We both knew the line between failure and success was very thin indeed. I've been conscious of it ever since that night in Reino. Despite of House helping Jill recover, despite of him knowing the story inside and out, there was one question that nobody in this case knows 100% the answer to, and that is, why did Billy kill Sarah, being the father himself? This next part is my personal opinion that I have written after having researched this case for hours and days on end, and you can tell me what you think in the comments box. You don't have to agree with me, but in my opinion, he had to eliminate the biggest threats to him, the youngest and the oldest members of the family. He had to take one member of each family in order to control the rest of it. So he took Arthur from Amy, making her believe that he is just in the annex, in the same house. And then he used Sarah and interactions, supposed interactions with Sarah, to control Richard and Jill. Upon entering Pottery Cottage, he knew he was not going back to prison. Upon entering the room that he knew belonged to a child, he saw his chance to control that whole family. And that is exactly what he had executed. At what cost? Some might ask. Did Billy ever take into consideration his actual family, Jean and Nicola? No, he didn't, because everybody was just left completely scarred. And up until some of these family members actually decided to move on, and to move on physically, to move out of this location, they wouldn't find peace. Because as you can imagine, when this story is in the news, everybody that he had been associated with is getting harassed. So Jean and Nicola were just getting harassed, interviewed, asked for different things, like asked why did they love him, like what he was like. Nicola was harassed in school to the point that her mom had to tell her about her father and about what he did, and she was barely a teenager at this point. Nicola couldn't be protected forever. Alan, Billy's brother, would be in and out of prison as well, so Jean had to raise her own kids and then Nicola as well. So by the age of 14, eventually, Nicola had learned about her dad. And from that point on as well, what didn't really help because of the external pressures was how Jean treated Nicola. Like, she would sometimes be like, "You're just like your dad. You're a psychopath yourself." And she would take all of this anger at her teenage daughter. This led Nicola to leaving school at the age of 15, finding a job, and also, because she needed counseling, started getting addicted to antidepressants. I realize now that I had forgotten to put yet another trigger warning at the beginning of this. I would suggest skipping to the timestamp on the screen because these next couple of lines are about dying by suicide. Because in May of 1998, Jean couldn't take it anymore. She took the overdose of different medications in the bathroom of her house and she tied a plastic bag over her head. By the time that she was found, it was too late, and she was only 52 years old when she died, with the inquest later returning the verdict of suicide. 7 months later, Nicola actually kissed her children goodbye and also tried to overdose with a handful of pills. However, luckily, she was found in time, rushed to the hospital, and after this event, something finally caused her to just take action and move out of that place for the sake of her children. So, as soon as she distanced herself, just like everybody else, it's as if the spell of Billy Hughes had been lifted and she just moved on. I don't know if Nicola had changed her name, but she managed to move on and find a better life for her kids. As for the house itself, it went up to the market that same year, and I can't actually find when it was sold, like was it sold in 1977, but eventually it was, and it was sold to a husband and wife, and the husband here bizarrely is also called Richard. They said they were not superstitious, like they knew of the house's history, and they wouldn't have bought it had Billy been alive and in jail because they just didn't trust that he wouldn't escape and then go back to the Pottery Cottage, or that he wouldn't be released one day and then come to find them. So they only bought it because they knew of the outcome and they knew that Billy Hughes was dead. When it comes to Jill, Jill moved on herself and she kind of left this part of her life behind as well. Jill got remarried to a guy called Jim, and his mother was Richard, so like her ex-husband's foster sister Anne. They moved out together and they got married in 1978 and they ended up having a girl who Jill named Jane Sarah, in memory of the half-sister that she would never meet. In 1988, even though Jill had moved on, she would make the news again. And this is because her new husband, Jim, was due to be sentenced. Apparently due to the pressure that the family was still getting because of the Pottery Cottage hostage situation, he started cracking under pressure and threatening people at the bar. It was said that somebody refused to have a drink with him, so he went home and then reappeared at the pub with a weapon, with a gun, but later dropped it and didn't fire it. However, then he would have to go in front of the judge because of the firearm offenses. He was jailed for 2 years, and after his release from prison, the family would move to Ireland. And this is when Jane actually started a successful career as a jockey for several years. It is said that this would be the penultimate appearance of Jill in the press. The last appearance was in 1999, when she had only one statement to give to the journalist who called upon her, and this statement speaks volumes about Jill and how she feels about the Pottery Cottage murders now. She said, "I've put everything behind me and my life is very happy." There's no news here, and from what I had seen from the articles in 2022, she's now in her 80s. I believe she is still very much alive, and she had no objection to the book. However, I don't think that she had contributed anything to it. The book that was written by House that I had read for this case, and it was published in 2020. Yet again, just proving that everybody had to leave the place that was forever stained by Billy Hughes in order to move on. So this is where this case stands now. But there is one part that I am yet to tackle, and that is the accountability. Because when I read this book, I was just racking my brain, really like the outcome of the book, the whole inquiries and inquest, and mostly inquiries part, of just reports being released, recommendations being made. I thought there was a recent story. There was a story that I have read this summer that reminded me of something very similar. The story in itself is completely different to the story of Pottery Cottage murders that I have just told you, and it is this one. In summer of 2022, Met Police apologized after the strip search of a 15-year-old black girl who was strip searched in her school because it was believed she smelled of cannabis after the report found it was unjustified and that racism was an influencing factor for the officers. This search of the teenage girl that was named Child Q in the news happened in 2020 in the school of Hackney. I think most people here are familiar with it because it also led to multiple protests here in London in particular. And obviously they again went through an inquiry. There was a report to have been published and there was a wait for that report, and it was finally published in 2022. The outcome of the review, calls for the Department for Education to make more explicit reference to safeguarding in its guidance on searching, screening and confiscation, and for police guidance on strip searching children to clearly outline the need for a focus on safeguarding. So this review ended in 8 findings and 14 recommendations. Recommendations meaning that nobody really had been held responsible. Well, I actually lie, because yet again I have dug up an article about how the matters were identified that required new notices of investigation to be served to 4 constables. So 4 people have been advised that they are being investigated for potential breaches of the police standards. And this might lead to gross misconduct, but it also doesn't necessarily mean that disciplinary proceedings will follow. According to most sources, no names have been dropped here. This is still an internal investigation, and probably as such we will never even have the names, even if these police officers have some actions taken against them. So on the surface, these 2 stories have nothing in common, apart from the decision makers not being identified. In the case of Billy Hughes, someone decided how the areas will be searched when a knife went missing. Someone conducted the pat-downs, and crucially, a knife was missing from the prison kitchens for over a month, which if found would have prevented the slaughter of a family. In the case of Child Q, someone called the shots on a teenager being strip searched and humiliated in her school. Someone made sure a parent was not present. And in both cases, those people, the ones who were in charge, have not been held accountable. Rather, system changes have been identified and recommendations made. But the system can't be charged with terrorizing and murder of the whole family. The system can't be charged with terrorizing a teenage girl. People can. And that is the story of Pottery Cottage murders. I know that took a turn. And I am fuming as I have been fuming while researching this case, because it's just bizarre that something like this happened in 1977, 45 years ago, and that, at least in my opinion, can happen to a certain degree today. I'd like to believe there are better communications when it comes to the police stations, when it comes to different agencies, that people would have already known that Billy was in the system, the violent nature of his crimes, that he wouldn't have been able to escape from prison, that he would have been in prison for life or for a substantial amount of time in the first place until he's actually proven to have been rehabilitated, that he wouldn't be able, somebody like that wouldn't be able to work inside of prison kitchens, that he wouldn't be able to go to court hearings as and when he wanted, that the transportation wouldn't take place inside of a cab, that the knife search wouldn't take over a month, and even then people would have just given up because the knife just hadn't been found inside of the prison cells. However, what I can't believe is the institutions, the national agencies, actually dropping names and charging people, and people taking accountability instead of a system, instead of calling it a system failure. And that's something where I haven't seen a change in 45 years. If you have, cases, names, things to prove me wrong, drop those in the comments, because that is just worrying. I'm in customer service and I if I were to fuck up on something minor, it wouldn't be minor, that's the thing, it would be like a refund. Or, I don't know, it would be sharing personal data with a customer that isn't their business of knowing. I could lose my job. I would have to suffer the consequences. And I just don't see the same applying for people who have much higher responsibilities than I ever will. And I don't know why, but that just doesn't sit right with me. So that is why we have covered this case and why you have listened to it, because I have been raging ever since I found out the outcome of this story, and then it reminded me of the story of the girl Q, and then I just started raging even further because I was like 45 years later, we are still putting it as recommendations and system failures. It's just not good enough. So that is my message to you on this Saturday afternoon. I don't know when you're watching this. Whenever you're watching this, rage with me. And tell me if you agree or disagree on any of the comments that I have made on Billy Hughes, on this case, on the system in general, especially if you're from the UK. I'd like to know your thoughts. But I am out now, starting and probably finishing this edit and staying up until like 2 a.m. until I do it. Let's do it, let's do it. Let's take freaking responsibility for our own actions for a change, and surround yourself with positive people, okay? And if people are like cancerous, leave them in the past, move the fuck away, as everybody did with Billy Hughes. Leave the motherfuckers in the past, move away into a better life, and immediately the spell will be just lifted. I'll be like, oh my god, new person, who is this? Cool, Maya out now, Maya out. There's a car alarm. There's so many noises that you have heard here today, and the house workers, scaffolders are gonna wake me up tomorrow morning. It's all cool. It's all cool. No complaints. I'm gonna take responsibility for my own actions and staying up all night to like edit this, and then I will not blame it on them. See how we solved that? Easy. Okay, my out now. My out. Bye guys. See you later.